Why did God allow the beautiful temple that Solomon built, that took years to plan by David, a temple made of the finest materials and lavished with pure gold, silver, and bronze, a temple which symbolized the presence of God, to be destroyed? The temple was standing for 410 years before God allowed it to be destroyed by the Babylonians. What is the use of a beautiful outside appearance when the presence of God doesn't reside there? The people of Israel is the one who drove the presence of God out of that temple. We see that in the book of Jeremiah. God doesn't want religious practices and outside appearances. He wants obedience, reverence, holiness, and fear of the Lord. The people of Israel were performing sacrifices to him, yes, but when they went out from his presence, they bowed down to foreign gods and they wanted the life that the foreign nations lived. Similarly to us, we can be stars in the presence of God, but the real test is outside the doors of the church. What was the need for the Book of Lamentations? To voice their despair at the ruin of Solomon's temple and the exile of the people. To understand that there are consequences of unrepentance, whether it's Judah or whether it's us. And to offer hope and reveal God's sovereignty and, most importantly, his mercy and faithfulness. It is really an appeal to God for mercy after the devastation that Judah went through. And how does it speak to us in our lives to show us that constant unrepentance leads to consequences? Lamenting is something that people who go through sorrow, grief, heartbreak, and disappointment do in order to process their pain. But prayerful lament is to cry out to God, and we know that God responds to tears. When we pour out our pain, our complaints, our desire for justice and confusion to God in prayer, we are actually declaring that God is the only one who can comfort, calm, judge, and give clarity to our difficult circumstances. And the Book of Lamentations shows us that it is a normal thing. It's not shameful for a human being to experience suffering. And in the context of this book, even though God sent pain and suffering to punish the nation of Israel for their breaking of the covenant, he does not delight in tormenting people. The author of Lamentations is anonymous, but very strongly assumed to be Jeremiah, and this is the reason why. We believe that because he was called the weeping prophet, and Lamentations is a record of that weeping. Also, the Book of Lamentations was part of the Book of Jeremiah, but later on it was separated because it was read at one of the feasts of Israel called Tish B'Av, a festival to remember the destruction of Judah and the temple. Now, some background knowledge of the temple. The first temple was built by Solomon. It was the most beautiful temple ever built in Jerusalem. It was destroyed by the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar. The second temple, if we can go back to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, remember that King Cyrus released a decree to rebuild the temple, and Zerubbabel was sent to do the rebuilding of the temple. Nehemiah built the walls, and that temple was not nearly as beautiful as the first temple that Solomon built, and that temple was destroyed 40 years later after the death and resurrection of Jesus by the Romans during a war. The third temple has currently not been built as yet in Jerusalem. So right now in Jerusalem, there's no temple, but only the Temple Mount. Lamentations is a very unique book in the Old Testament, and it's a very short book. It contains 5 poems from the author who survived Babylonian siege of Jerusalem and the exile of the Israelites, and that is another reason why it's assumed to be Jeremiah. In this book, the author reflects on this particular event, which is the fall of Jerusalem and Judah. So the fall of Jerusalem and the exile was the worst event in Israel's history up to that point. And God had promised Abraham the land of Canaan and all the promised land. And he had also given David the instruction to make Jerusalem the capital of Israel. So chapter 1 focuses on the grief and shame of a figure called Lady Zion. Zion is the name given to Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem is referred to as a widow, as the daughter of Zion. She sits alone, bereaved of her loved ones, devastated, with no one to comfort her. Her city was destroyed and her citizens were exiled by the Babylonians. So that is why she's likened to a widow who has lost everything, abandoned by her allies and stripped of her former glory. The city walls were broken, the temple was destroyed, and her people were violently taken into captivity. The neighboring nations and political alliances she trusted turned on her and became her enemies. And we can go back to the book of Isaiah when Isaiah warned King Hezekiah not to show the treasury to Babylon. And later on, the empire of Babylon will come against them. And it has come to pass. Her suffering is a result of God's judgment for her people's rebellion and unfaithfulness. So as Lady Zion speaks in this book, she calls on the Lord to notice her fate. Jerusalem's destruction brought a level of psychological trauma on the Israelites, and they expressed this in chapter 1 as a funeral. The death of the loved one in this case is the city of Jerusalem. Chapter 2 focuses on the fall of Jerusalem and how Israel's sin brought God's wrath. God's wrath is not spontaneous. It's a build-up because of disobedience after disobedience. He brought prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah to warn the people to turn from their sin, but to no avail. Israel entered a covenant agreement, and they have been violating it for centuries through their worship of other gods, allowing injustice towards the poor. And while God is slow to anger, he still does get angry at human evil. And he will eventually bring his justice, whether it is to his nation of Israel or surrounding nations. So while God's wrath was justified, it doesn't keep this poet from lamenting and asking God to once again show compassion on Jerusalem. So while we go through a bad season, it doesn't stop us from lamenting and asking God for mercy and grace. In chapter 3, you hear the voice of a suffering man who speaks as a representative of the nation of Israel. Now, chapter 1 was described as a widow who is grieving. And chapter 2 speaks of God's wrath. Chapter 3 is the voice of a suffering man. And this chapter, we also see the laments of Job, the laments of Psalms, and also the suffering servant poems in Isaiah. And some of the key verses are here in chapter 3. Because of the Lord's covenant faithfulness, we do not perish. His mercies never fail. They are new every morning. How great is your faithfulness, O God! So I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance. Therefore, I will put my hope in him. The poet goes on by saying, if God is consistent enough to bring his justice on Israel's evil, then he will also be consistent with his covenant promises. For this poet, God's judgment becomes the seed of hope. So this book is not just a book that people can reflect back to when they are going through seasons of lamenting and sorrow and grief. But in this book, this poet is really crying out to God to turn his face with favor and mercy and grace to Jerusalem. Chapter 4 compares how the Jerusalem of the past is contrasted to how terrible it has become after the destruction by Babylon. Children were once in the streets, now they beg for food. The wealthy once ate lavish meals, now they look for whatever they can find in the dirt. The leaders were full of splendor, and now they're unrecognizable. Their kings that came from the line of David have been captured and dragged away. So chapter 4 shows the depth of the suffering that Israel brought on itself. And we see this is what the siege of Jerusalem did by the Babylonians. Before the final exile, the Babylonians came against Jerusalem multiple times. And the famine inside the city was so severe that people started eating their own children. and the wealthy scavenged for food in the garbage dumps. Dead bodies littered the streets due to starvation and disease. And with the destruction of the temple, the final destruction, King Nebuchadnezzar's forces burned Solomon's temple and the royal palaces, leveling the city walls, and the priests and political leaders were executed, and the vessels from the sacred temple were looted and taken to Babylon. Many of the people that were taken into exile taken to the countryside of Babylon, and they were integrated as farmers, builders, artisans, and they lived their lives in captivity and exile. And they were just given rations of food, of grain, and of oil. And they were cut from their holy city, and they started believing in those pagan practices of the Babylonian culture. So, indeed, it not only brought much physical but psychological devastation on the people of Israel. Now, chapter 5 is the final poem, and it is a community poem from the nation of Israel for God's mercy. And here you see that Israel begs God not to ignore their pain or abandon them. And this lament poem is written on behalf of others to give expression to their pain. And as God's people, Lamentations teaches us not to deny our emotions, but rather to voice our protest, to vent, and to pour it all before God. And the book ends as the poet acknowledges that God is the eternal King. And right now, Israel's circumstances may feel as if God is nowhere to be found. But the end of this book leaves us with one question. Has God abandoned his people because of disobedience? And also this book shows us that lament and prayer are crucial in our journey. Lamenting is a powerful act of humility. By bringing your deepest sorrows and frustrations to God, you acknowledge your limitations and your dependence on his strength. And it's an expression of trust, showing that you are willing to be honest and vulnerable, than rather to be prideful and rely on yourself. And in the Christian faith, lamenting is highly regarded and encouraged. And while it may involve crying in pain or confusion, it is very different from complaining. God does not want complaints. He rather wants your laments. So, how do we lament? When we lament, we do it by expressing our feelings without putting up a facade. There's a level of honesty in the lament that you bring to God. And bring your complaint directly to him rather than turning away from him. Lamenting also helps us to reaffirm our faith and declare our trust in God's sovereign power and love, even when we don't understand the circumstances. And the answer to the question, has God abandoned his people because of disobedience? No, God made a way for Judah to return home 70 years after the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. So when God brought this destruction, it was a time of spiritual refining and rest. And at the end of 2 Chronicles, we also see that the Persian king Cyrus the Great issued a decree allowing the Jewish people to come back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So no, God has not abandoned his people. And if we look at proof in the book of Judges that God does indeed respond to our cries, to our tears, to our lamenting. Because we see that in that book of Judges, Israel lamented and cried out to God 7 times. And each of these cries prompted God to hear them. And he appeared by raising up a specific judge and sending a divine messenger to rescue them. So I hope that this book of Lamentations has given you a deeper understanding in the book while reading scripture. I hope you are indeed enjoying the Bible studies on this channel. And please join us for more. Take care and God bless.